Hey, welcome back to the channel. I am your humble host, D-Vase. That's talent on loan from Kolob. Today, we're going to bring you an episode about something that I've been wanting to talk about for a long time. It's the book, The Late War Between the United States and Great Britain. And we're going to be comparing that with Joseph Smith's Book of Mormon. And there are a number of fascinating parallels. And here's the thing, Joseph Smith probably grew up reading The Late War, which was written by Gilbert J. Hunt, and it may have heavily influenced the Book of Mormon's construction. Let's give you a little bit of introduction. The War of 1812 was to Joseph Smith what 9/11 was to many of us here in the United States. Very real and a very recent memory. Many people have asked why the Book of Mormon includes so much war. Could the War of 1812 have played a part in inspiring Joseph Smith's imagination when he wrote the Book of Mormon? Many people believe that the Book of Mormon, like other creative works, is simply a remix or pseudepigrapha, meaning that it was remixed from the ideas available to Joseph Smith in his time. One of those books in Joseph Smith's milieu was Gilbert Hunt's The Late War Between Great Britain and the United States. It was a historical account of the War of 1812, and it was published in New York in 1816. Between 1817 and 1819, it was marketed for use in the schools throughout the United States under the title The Historical Reader. It was a historical account of the then recent War of 1812, and it was written in a scriptural style, much like the King James Version of the Bible. There are three editions of the Late War: the 1816 version, the 1817 version, and the third edition in 1819. The 1817 and 1819 editions are almost identical. So not only is the Book of Mormon written in a scriptural style, but the Late War is, and several other books in Joseph Smith's milieu. When the Late War was published, Joseph Smith would have been 12 years old. Interestingly, an academic in New York named Samuel Mitchell wrote a letter of endorsement for the Late War, and it was published in the preface of Hunt's book. Mitchell was pleased that a historian had used a scriptural style as a popular means of encouraging children to turn to the Holy Scriptures. And here's just one of many parallels. When Joseph Smith sent Martin Harris to seek endorsements for the Book of Mormon, one of the people that Martin visited was Samuel Mitchell. Could Joseph Smith have sought Mitchell's endorsement because Mitchell had endorsed The Late War, a book that was oh so similar, as we're going to find out, to the Book of Mormon? Without a strong link between these two books, the similarities would be hard to explain. Because as we're going to demonstrate in this episode, there are over 100 rare phrases that bind the Book of Mormon and the Late War closely together. I'm talking about phrases that do not show up in other contemporary books, or if they do, they're incredibly rare. And I mean rare. In addition, the two books use very similar language while detailing shared events and themes, such as battles at forts and rivers, weapons of curious workmanship, 2,000 soldiers including striplings, bands of robbers, martyrs burned, righteous versus savage nations, cataclysmic events, Christopher Columbus, false prophets, fighting for the cause of liberty, freemen versus men of the king, silver plates and engravings in brass, and many others. Now, much of today's episode is taken from Chris and Dwayne Johnson's work, and they published this on wordtree.org/The Late War. By way of summary, in October of 2013, the Johnsons conducted a data analysis comparing the Book of Mormon to over 100,000 works that were published prior to 1830. It was essentially a giant dragnet to see what would pop up. I mean, what would be similar. Out of all of those matches, they found The Late War as the single most similar book to the Book of Mormon. Now, there are a number of interesting parallels between the Book of Mormon and the Late War, and as you can see here, they are striking. However, it is important to point out that some of these parallels may not be as impressive as one might imagine. Let's hear from David Snell over there at the Keystone channel, who points out an objection.
Let's explore one or two examples. In the Late War, it says, "Sent forth a proclamation abroad, and it came to pass that a great multitude flocked to the standard of Columbia. They came in battle array against the." And in the Book of Mormon it says, "Sent a proclamation throughout the land, and it came to pass that thousands did flock unto his standard of liberty. They went down with their armies against the." They seem pretty similar, huh? They're pretty suspicious. But there sure are a lot of ellipses in there. Well, let's take a look at what text has been omitted from these examples to see just how similar they actually are. Obviously, critics are highly manipulative in the way they present these parallels that have been cherry-picked and conveniently smashed together.
I think David Snell's criticism is pretty good here, but even though the Johnsons may have strained to find some of the parallels, there are still too many similarities to be overlooked. And some of the parallels that I'm going to show you in this episode are far better than the ones that David picked apart. Like I said, some of those parallels may be strained just a little bit, but more demonstrable and powerful connections can be demonstrated through the computer-aided analysis of what is called 4-gram matches. While some of the parallels in the late war may be seen as superficial, there is definitely a demonstrable, powerful connection between these two works, which has been uncovered by the computer-aided discovery of matching rare 4 grams. If a 4-word phrase, also known as a 4-gram, shows up less than 1 out of every 1,000 books, that's considered to be a rare 4-gram. But before we talk about this analysis, we have to remove the biblical 4 grams from the Book of Mormon, because there's whole sections of Isaiah and several other passages that are lifted right out of the King James Version of the Bible. Once you remove those King James passages, there's over 100 rare 4-gram matches between the Book of Mormon and the late war. To put this into perspective, the Johnsons found that the late war contained more rare 4-gram matches to the Book of Mormon than 99.999% of books published before 1830. For comparison purposes, if we choose an arbitrary book from Joseph Smith's time, like Pride and Prejudice, and compare it to the Book of Mormon, the comparison shows a very low number of rare 4-gram matches per 1,000 words. The late war, on the other hand, scored significantly higher. Many Book of Mormon apologists want to point to the presence of chiasmus in the Book of Mormon as supposed proof of asemitic origin. But here's the thing, chiasm shows up in many texts, including the late war. Here is one 21-pair chiastic structure found in the late war, which of course is published in 1816. It pairs 21 elements. If chiasm is supposed to be an evidence of the Book of Mormon's ancient Semitic origins, then why is it not an argument for the late war's ancient Semitic origins? Let's talk just a little bit more about that Joseph Smith-Samuel Mitchell connection. Joseph Smith probably directed Martin Harris to visit Samuel Mitchell. This is in addition to Martin's famed visit to Professor Charles Anthon. Let's read from the Palmyra Freeman in 1829.
So blindly enthusiastic was Harris, that he took some of the characters interpreted by Smith, and went in search of someone, besides the interpreter, who was learned enough to English them, but all to whom he applied, among the number was Professor Mitchell, of New York, happened not to be possessed of sufficient knowledge to give satisfaction. Harris returned, and set Smith to work at interpreting the Bible.
In the preface to the second and third editions of Gilbert Hunt's The Late War, Samuel Mitchell endorsed Hunt's book. Let's check it out.
It seems to me one of the best attempts to imitate the biblical style, and if the perusal of it can induce young persons to relish and love the sacred books whose language you have imitated, it will be the strongest of all recommendations.
And Gilbert Hunt himself explained his intention right here.
Professor Samuel L. Mitchell, formerly of Columbia College, had concluded that 2 main groups of people once dominated the Americas, the Tartars of Northern Asia and the Australasians of the Polynesian Islands. Furthermore, they fought one another for many years, culminating in great battles of extermination in what later became upstate New York. This New York theory has much in common with the Book of Mormon. While visiting Professor Charles Anthon in New York in 1828, Martin Harris also met with Mitchell, an encounter that lent support to Harris's work on the Book of Mormon.
Samuel Mitchell was a strong proponent of the theory of origins of ancient Americans that is largely compatible with the Book of Mormon. The endorsements in the late war are clearly an effort to give the book legitimacy, and hence improve its marketability. Hunt was wise in getting the endorsement of Mitchell, who was well known as kind of a human encyclopedia. The late war also includes other endorsements, which again were probably sought to give the book legitimacy. And here's the big takeaway. If Joseph Smith was indeed familiar with the late war, this may explain why he sought to get endorsements for the Book of Mormon as well. How available was the late war to New York students? We know that Hunt intended to market his book, but did it actually reach his intended audience? Well, let's hear from Rick Grunder.
The number of copies present in libraries today is relatively large, showing that many copies were indeed printed, and most copies which I see show considerable wear, suggesting that they were used heavily over the years, and that most copies were logically read to death and no longer survive at all, which lends more significance, for presumed large numbers printed, to the number which still survive, than if those modern survivals were all in fresh, unread condition.
And in the world's largest open library system, the online computer library center, we find that there's 158 copies of the Late War in the system. It definitely seems like the Late War was available in the right time and location for Joseph Smith, but can we definitively prove that he had access to it? The Johnson's probabilistic evidence is clear. However, there are additional reasons to believe that Joseph Smith had access to the book that had nothing to do with the Johnson's analysis. Remember, Joseph Smith was closely connected to at least 3 teachers. Joseph Smith Jr.'s father, Joseph Smith Sr., was an occasional teacher during the farming off-season. Joseph's wife, Emma Hale Smith, was also a teacher. And number 3, remember, Oliver Cowdery's involvement in the Book of Mormon came when he was a traveling teacher and he was lodging with the Smiths. Another way to look at this question is, given the War of 1812 was such a prominent historical subject, one that would have been taught and discussed at great length during Joseph Smith's teenage years, what textbook other than the Great War was more likely to have been used to cover the subject matter by teachers he knew? One of the Book of Mormon's most common phrases is, "and it came to pass." Mark Twain famously mocked the phrase, "and it came to pass," in his 1872 book, Roughing It.
The book seems to be merely a prosy detail of imaginary history, with the Old Testament for a model, followed by a tedious plagiarism of the New Testament. The author labored to give his words and phrases the quaint, old-fashioned sound and structure of our King James's translation of the Scriptures, and the result is a mongrel, half-modern glibness, and half-ancient simplicity and gravity. The latter is awkward and constrained, the former natural, but grotesque by the contrast. Whenever he found his speech growing too modern, which was about every sentence or two, he ladled in a few such scriptural phrases as, "exceeding sore," "and it came to pass," and made things satisfactory again. "And it came to pass" was his pet. If he had left that out, his Bible would have been only a pamphlet.
But here's a chart which visualizes the phrase, "and it came to pass." Notice the percentage of the use of "it came to pass" of total words in the Bible, the First Book of Napoleon, the Late War, and the Book of Mormon. We can see a high density of "and it came to pass" in the Late War and the Book of Mormon in particular. Both books are strikingly similar in their description of the Americas. The types of things worthy of mention in the books are alike: metals, fruits, and animals. It's noteworthy that the Book of Mormon lists European animals instead of animals native to the Americas, such as the tapir. And oddly, in the same section that the Book of Mormon mistakenly includes elephants as native to America, the Late War mentions the elephant in comparison to mammoths. And remember, Orson Pratt, Mormon apostle, said that a curellum was a mammoth in the Journal of Discourses. In the 1816 version of the Late War between the United States and Great Britain, George Croghan is a key figure. Major George Croghan was an American military officer best known for his defense of Fort Stephenson during the War of 1812. Now, we can compare the elements of the Croghan battles versus the elements of the Captain Moroni battles in the Book of Mormon, and we will see some significant similarities, including sharing phraseology and even the basic plot. The protagonist men prepare for a battle at their fort, the enemies attack, the ditches around the forts are filled with enemy bodies, and then the enemy eventually flees into the forest. Some may argue that these structures are just too common, that this is a basic structure common to many battles. However, there are distinctive elements to these descriptions that raise the question, how could two battles separated by nearly 2,000 years be described by two different people in so similar a manner? In the context of the strong evidence of a connection between the Late War and the Book of Mormon, is it reasonable to conclude that the structure is coincidence rather than imitative? And notice that the river battles are also quite similar. Historical works describing the War of 1812 use quite a bit of variation when describing the casualties. For instance, let's compare the history of the United States of America with the Annals of America. But what's interesting is that when we compare the Book of Mormon and the Late War, the Book of Mormon adopts the Late War's casualty reporting system. For instance, the Book of Mormon never reports about dying or missing soldiers. In fact, the Book of Mormon never mentions anyone who's maimed. It seems like whoever wrote the Book of Mormon was familiar with how the Late War reports its casualties. And the books also have very similar ways of reporting weapons of war. The Late War does not contain the phrase stripling warriors like the Book of Mormon does. However, it does share a similarity in context with the Book of Mormon story. Namely, that there are striplings in battle, including a band of 2,000 courageous soldiers who volunteer in a desperate fight for freedom of their country against an oppressive king. The king in the Book of Mormon is Amalickiah, and the king in the Late War is King George III. Both Both books also mention bands of robbers. There are numerous references to destroying robbers in the Book of Mormon and none in the Bible. While there are no doubt other potential sources, it is interesting that both the Late War and the Book of Mormon speak of going against the band of robbers and destroying them. Both books mention pitching tents on the borders. They also talk about burned martyrs. The accounts both mention mourning the dead. Both tales make a delineation between righteous Indians and savage Indians, and they both cover missionary work to the natives. The Late War mentions 3 of the Indian prophets, and the Book of Mormon also talks about 3 disciples of Jesus. Both books have similarities when it comes to how people travel. The Late War discusses barges and vessels, and so does the Book of Mormon in the Book of Ether. There are similarities in the way that they discuss faraway lands. In both books, we have references to thunder, large groups of people falling to the earth, rocks being raised and falling causing deaths, fragments of rocks, the face of the earth, the thick darkness which prevents anyone from seeing each other or anything around them. It is also interesting that there are mentions of sinking and drowning in the Book of Mormon, which would make more sense if the Late War had been an influence since it includes descriptions of water battles. Both the Late War and the Book of Mormon share an anecdote of a leader who's considering a problem that he has never dealt with. In the Late War, it's the military leader Captain Carden, who is troubled with the capture of a British warship as he contemplates the geopolitical implications of the act. In the Book of Mormon, it is the spiritual leader Alma who contemplates what should be done with dissenters who are causing trouble in the church, in the context of separation of church and state. Both books discuss flocking to a symbol of liberty. For example, people choosing sides in a civil war between one side that is loyal to a king and the other side that is in favor of freedom from kings. In both books, we see the cause of liberty as an important motif. We also see spiritual beings entering into people's hearts. We also see a similarity in the use of lions, being used figuratively. The fact that both books use lion isn't particularly strange since the Bible is full of figurative language around the subject. However, there were no lions in the Americas during the time of the Book of Mormon period. So for Joseph to have used lions is an anachronism. It makes no sense for him to have used them. It makes no sense for Jesus to have spoken to the Nephites about lions since they wouldn't have been familiar with them. And again, it makes no sense for Mormon to have talked about lions since he wouldn't have known about them either. Christopher Columbus is a controversial figure. Was he a brutal slave master or an inspired leader? Whatever he was, the Late War and the Book of Mormon share the same high regard for Columbus. As you can see, the Late War esteems him highly, as does the Book of Mormon. Both books discuss the 4th of July. Now, of course, not all books mention dates, but when they do, they can be expressed in various formats. While it may be odd that both books mention the same date, expressed in the same format, it's not impossible for that to be a coincidence. For example, the 4-gram phrase of the 7th month shows up numerous times in the Bible. However, the 4-gram 7th month, which is, turns out to be many times more rare than the actual date match itself. The fact that this rare 4-gram is accompanied by the exact same date makes it even more rare. The reign of the judges was a government system in the Book of Mormon based on judges that supplanted kings. This change in Nephite government was apparently devastating to those of high birth, because later they plotted to overthrow the free government and bring back the system of old monarchy. Notice that the free government is the Nephite system of judges, which is supported by the freemen. And the dynamics are similar in the Late War, where we find freemen fighting to maintain a free government in the Second War for American Independence against the servants of the king. It's also interesting to note that both the Book of Mormon and the Late War not only replaced the monarchy with a free government, but also used the transition as a date marker. Both books count how many years had passed since the new government had started. The wording is very similar in both books. Both Nephi in the Book of Mormon and Robert Fulton, an engineer, both built ships. And I can't help but note the phrase, works of curious workmanship. Both books also seem to make reference to a curious compass-like object made of brass. Could this be the genesis of the Liahona in the Book of Mormon? Did the Late War inspire Joseph Smith to consider brass as a storage medium for the deeds of ancient people? In addition to mentioning brass as a medium of record, the Late War refers to a silver plate given to Captain Oliver Perry from the people, or the government. Both books are sure to mention false prophets. The War of 1812 has been called the Second War of Independence because it settled once and for all the sovereignty of the United States of America and permanently separated the nation from Great Britain. During this conflict, however, the question of loyalty arose among the colonists once more. Would they be true to their new and fledgling nation, the Freemen, or yield to the strong ties that they had to their mother country, the Tories? This division plays out in the Book of Mormon as a battle of might and will between the Freemen and the Kingmen. The Late War reveals a cultural attitude towards women that is shared in the Book of Mormon. Women are often spoken as tender and fair, prey to the lusts of men. The Book of Mormon and the Late War share a number of rare phrase matches. And indeed, these phrases are rare, meaning that they are not found in any other book in Joseph Smith's time. And they are not found in the King James Version of the Bible. The strength of the argument that the Book of Mormon is a remix of the Late War rests on the cumulative improbability of finding all of these phrases somewhere else. No other book, aside from the first book of Napoleon, approaches the density of rare phrases. That's 4 grams specifically, that are shared by the Book of Mormon. There are perhaps thousands of matching phrases between the Late War and the Book of Mormon that could be considered somewhat common phrases, linking the two books. Word phrases that match exactly are bold red. Words that are synonymous or have some connection, but not an exact match, are italicized orange. Needless to say, these common phrases are abundant. It's amusing that some people point to certain phrases in the Book of Mormon as supposed evidence of its divine authenticity. A perfect example of this is the word whirlwind that is found in the Book of Mormon. However, the word whirlwind also appears in the Late War. The Book of Mormon and the Late War are fond of posing negative questions. Do ye not? Are they not? Are we not? Know ye not? Shall we not rather? Is this not? And while Ben Spackman poses that negative questions in the Book of Mormon represent clear Hebrew influence, the fact that they are also common in the Late War undermines his argument. John Tvednes talks about the constructive state in the Book of Mormon, specifically that the Book of Mormon uses rod of iron, words of plainness, works of righteousness, or chains of hell. He argues that this particular constructive state shows that the Book of Mormon is preserving a Hebrew word order. However, this constructive state is also found in the Late War. Rod of iron, word of Satan, ways of God, balls of iron, pen of iron. Both the Book of Mormon and the Late War also use compound prepositions. And while Hebrew often uses compound prepositions, the fact that they are also in the Late War, again, undermines the argument for the Book of Mormon's Hebrew origins. Both the Book of Mormon and the Late War contain adverbials. Again, John Tvednes argues that this is another Hebraism. The Book of Mormon contains a number of adverbials. For instance, with patience, with joy, with much harshness, in spirit and in truth. John Tvednes argues that this is another Hebraism showing the Book of Mormon's ancient origins. However, the Late War also contains adverbials, with reference, with joy, with great violence, in sorrow. As we're wrapping things up here, it's important for me to point out my own spiritual journey with regards to the Late War. I remember reading the first few verses of the Late War. The incredible similarity between the Book of Mormon's prose and the Late War showed to me once and for all that someone with a limited education could easily write something with a King James Version style prose that sounded exactly like the Book of Mormon without divine intervention. And while you can argue with some of these particular parallels that we brought up in today's episode, it's the cumulative weight of all of these little items that we brought up that really should make the difference for anyone who is really trying to be objective about the possible parallels between these two books. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Is there a striking similarity between the Late War and the Book of Mormon, or is this just parallelomania? Thanks so much for joining me on another episode of the Mormon News Roundup. Please like and subscribe and turn on notifications. Always think celestial and remember, no unhallowed hand can stop the Mormon News Roundup from progressing.
Hey folks, Joe Biden here. Thanks for watching Mormon News Roundup. My good friend D. Vase is truly doing the Lord's work. No joke. Remember, no unhallowed hand can stop the Mormon News Roundup from progressing. Like, subscribe, and stay informed. That's a fact, Jack.